Hey guys, how's it going? So for this video, I want to discuss and analyze the 9th episode of Season 4 of Better Call Saul, entitled Wiedersehen. This was a rather surprising episode in many ways that displayed many unexpected plots that transpired over the course of this episode, which in the end raised many more questions than I thought it would answer heading into the Season 4 finale next week. So without further delay, let's jump right into this review for Episode 9 of Season 4. Okay, so the cold opening scene of this episode displayed to us the explanation for what Kim meant when she stated to Jimmy, "Let's do it again," following their plot that transpired regarding Huel at the end of episode 8. During this scene, we saw Kim, with the help of Jimmy, pull off the feat that Kevin Wachtel of Mesa Verde stated would be impossible of changing the design of the bank that was proposed for their planned branch in Lubbock, Texas, to resemble their design of the Tucumcari branch by enacting a very Jimmy McGill-esque plan in order to switch the bank proposal design documents. So in the end, while this scene was not the most exciting plot to follow Kim's vague proposal at the end of episode 8, it nonetheless still displayed to us Kim's somewhat morphing moral compass, where she enacted a plan that in the past she would have most certainly not condoned and would have likely found reprehensible, i.e. her response to when Jimmy told her that he had fabricated evidence in season 2 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Cobbler during his plot that transpired with Price. And taking all of that into account, this plot between Jimmy and Kim at the beginning of this episode would in many ways end up foreshadowing the rather unexpected plot that would transpire between these two characters over the course of this episode. So following this cold opening scene, the first scene in Act 1 then presented us with a full scene that was teased to us prior to this episode of Lalo and Nacho meeting with Hector at Casa Tranquila. During this scene, we definitively learned that Lalo is a member of the Salamancas, who even address Hector in this scene as Tio. Additionally, this scene also presented us with the backstory of how Hector would come to obtain the bell that he used in order to communicate over the course of Breaking Bad, which was given to him in this scene by Lalo, which also very interestingly appears to have a somewhat sentimental attachment to Hector, as we could see by the vague story that was told by Lalo in this scene. Moreover, this scene would of course also foreshadow the meeting between Lalo and Gus that took place in Act 2 following the conversation between Lalo and Hector that occurred off screen at the end of this scene. So following this scene, the second scene in Act 1 then presented us with a scene of Jimmy and Kim stopping at a diner during their drive back to Albuquerque from Lubbock. So while this scene ended up foreshadowing Jimmy's bar hearing that would take place in Act 3, this scene also presented us with a couple of key pieces of information regarding both of these characters as well. In regards to Kim, this scene displayed to us that while we could see that Kim was still willing to most certainly bend the rule of law past the precipice of breaking it, she's still by no means as willing to go full Saul Goodman, if you will, as we could see by her more or less rejecting Jimmy's proposal of teaming up together to pull off scams like they pulled for Huel as part of a full-time law practice. Directly in regards to the plot of Jimmy in this scene, we got to see one of the apparent reasons behind why he decided to change his name to Saul Goodman in the plot of Breaking Bad, as a result of him not wanting to confuse many of his prospective clients that he met while selling burner phones who knew him as Saul Goodman. That being said, in regards to the aforementioned foreshadowing that occurred during this scene, the hubris that Jimmy and Kim displayed with respect to Jimmy's reinstatement as a lawyer would of course come crashing down following Jimmy's bar hearing in Act 3. So following this scene, the final scene in Act 1 then presented us with the scene of the construction blast in order to make room for the elevator shaft for the super lab, which in the end went off basically without a hitch, following the sound of the explosion being masked by the sound of Tyrus driving by the industrial laundry during the explosion in a semi-truck. However, taking that into account, while this scene on the surface seemed to be a total success, the rather odd body language that Verner displayed in this scene would of course foreshadow the quite unexpected plot that would transpire between Mike and Verner in the final scene of this episode. So directly following this scene, the first scene in Act 2 then displayed to us the reasoning behind Verner's odd behavior that Mike noticed during the construction blast, where following the German workers celebrating the successful completion of this final construction blast, we then could see Mike ask Verner what was bothering him, to which following some prodding we learned that the long amount of time that Verner has been away from his wife is causing him a great amount of angst, who even went so far as to ask Mike if he could fly back to Germany to be with her for a few days. which was of course met with absolute disapproval by Mike due to the secrecy nature of this project, who did nonetheless appear to do Verner a favor and compromise with him by allowing him to speak with his wife on the phone. That being said, this scene would in the end further foreshadow the plot that would ensue at the end of this episode. So, following this scene, the second scene in Act 2 then presented us with what was without a doubt my favorite scene of this entire episode, which opened with Gus in his office at Los Pollos Hermanos, where he was then greeted by the assistant manager Lalo, who we first met in the plot of Season 3 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Sabrosito. During this scene, we saw Lyle state to Gus that one of the men, i.e. Nacho, was back at the restaurant, who Lyle recognized from the plot that transpired in the episode entitled Sabrosito, where Hector, along with Nacho and Arturo, essentially took the staff of Los Pollos Hermanos hostage. This was then met by Gus stating to Lyle that he would deal with this situation, which was then followed by Gus walking into the restaurant and speaking with Lalo, who was sitting in the restaurant with Nacho. So, following some small talk, this then led to Lalo speaking with Gus in private regarding the state of the business relationship between Gus and the Salamancas, who even went so far as to praise Gus for saving Hector's life in the plot of the Season 3 finale of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Lantern. So, taking all of this into account, while this scene was in the end rather cryptic in regards to Lalo's intentions for meeting with Gus following his conversation with Hector, I nonetheless absolutely love seeing this interaction between Lalo and Gus on screen for the first time in the plot of Better Call Saul, which most certainly has seemingly foreshadowed more to come between these characters in the plot of Better Call Saul, as we could see by Lalo stating to Nacho to drive into the Los Pollos Hermanos distribution center following them leaving the restaurant at the end of this scene. So, following the end of Act 2, Act 3 of this episode then presented us with one long continuous scene, which displayed Jimmy's bar hearing as part of his reinstatement process as a lawyer. However, while heading into this episode, I thought that it would be a done deal that Jimmy would be reinstated as a lawyer in this episode. During this scene, we learned that Jimmy's reinstatement was ultimately rejected due to the fact that some members of the committee found his demeanor at his hearing to be insincere, which, as we would see, caused Jimmy to become absolutely enraged upon discovering this at the end of the scene. And taking that into consideration, the fact that Jimmy did not mention Chuck at all during his hearing would of course come into play following the scene when an enraged Jimmy met with Kim at the top floor of the parking lot of Schweigert and Coakley in Act 4. So, following the end of Act 3, Act 4 of this episode then picked up with Mike at the warehouse monitoring the content of Verner's phone call back home to Germany with his wife. Again, while this phone call seemed to go off without any problems, Verner's body language following this phone call, as well as some glances that he directed towards the security cameras in the warehouse, would again further foreshadow Verner's intentions of ignoring Mike's demand that he not leave and go back to Germany to visit his wife at the end of this episode. So, following this scene, the second scene in Act 4 then presented us with the aftermath of Jimmy's bar hearing rejection, where a very upset Jimmy spoke with Kim about what happened at his bar hearing, where he appeared to be absolutely flabbergasted in regards to why he was not reinstated as a lawyer. Then, following Kim asking Jimmy what the committee's response was when he talked about Chuck at his hearing, Jimmy then stated to her that he did not mention Chuck at his hearing at all, and did not even know why he would have to. And following the statement by Jimmy, this conversation then proceeded to turn into a heated argument between these two characters regarding the fallout of Jimmy's bar hearing, where they then proceeded to air their grievances against one another. And taking all of that into account, while this scene seemed like it could be yet another event that would mark the spark that eventually causes the end of this relationship between these two characters, this plot would of course take another very surprising and intriguing turn in the first scene of the fifth and final act of this episode, where it appears that following Jimmy seeming as though he was ready to move out of Kim's apartment following this argument, Kim then once again proceeded to offer help to Jimmy regarding the appeal process in the aftermath of his bar hearing, which, based on the teaser that was displayed to us prior to next week, will seemingly encompass the majority of the plot between Jimmy and Kim in the Season 4 finale of Better Call Saul next week. And taking all of this into account, in regards to the relationship between Jimmy and Kim, this episode really continued to make me even more perplexed in regards to how exactly this relationship will seemingly come to its required end in the plot of Better Call Saul, and also really raised many more questions than it answered about this process, which appears to further indicate that the ending of this relationship will certainly not be as straightforward of a process as at one point in time I thought it would be. And finally, the very last scene in this episode in Act 5 then displayed to us the scene that this episode had been building up to over the course of the entire plot involving Mike and the German workers, which also displayed to us another meaning behind the title of this episode when we saw that Verner had gone behind Mike's back and had escaped from the warehouse in order to visit his wife in Germany by short-circuiting the security cameras of the warehouse in order to make his escape undetected, which was of course met with absolute dismay from Mike, who, as we all remember, went out on a limb and stuck out his neck for Verner to Gus in episode 8, following his transgression during the German workers' R&R, which most certainly has put Mike in a very bad place with Gus for vouching for someone who then went behind his back and disobeyed his orders. And taking all of this into consideration, I will be very curious to see what the aftermath of this plot will be for Mike as well as for Verner, who will most certainly be reprimanded, to put it lightly, if and when he is likely caught, which I think in the end could in many ways display the additional character development that Mike still needs to go through in the plot of Better Call Saul in order to become the character that he was when we first met him in the plot of Breaking Bad. And with all of these details about this episode being taken into consideration, at the end of the day, while I was a little surprised by the pace of this penultimate episode of Season 4, which was much slower than I thought it would be, speaking for myself, this episode still nonetheless really reminded me that there is still so much story that the creators of Better Call Saul still want to tell in regards to the more distant backstory of all of these characters before we begin to see the more immediate backstory of these characters in relation to the timeline of Breaking Bad unfold on screen in the plot of Better Call Saul. And with all of that being said, I will be very curious to see what all of these respective plots will encompass in the final episode of Season 4, along with what additional surprises will be displayed to us regarding all of these backstories in the Season 4 finale next week as well. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up, and also definitely make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos where I discuss and analyze my predictions regarding all of these plots leading up to the Season 4 finale of Better Call Saul next week. As always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thanks again for watching, and thank you so much for supporting this channel.